When Caleb Danner heard the words, he did not answer right away. He was standing in the corner office of Heartland Security Bank with his cap in his hands and mud drying at the edge of his boots. Across the desk sat Regional Executive Paul Renner, a man whose shirts looked pressed even when he was angry. Caleb had come to ask why the bank had frozen a cooperative equipment line 2 weeks before harvest, even though participating farms had met the payment benchmark set after spring flooding. Paul did not offer a chair. He flipped through a summary sheet, barely looking at Caleb himself, and said, "Mr. Danner, you need to understand something. In matters at this level, you're nobody." The room went still. Caleb was 68, broad-faced, slow-speaking, and known across 3 counties less for speeches than for showing up when somebody needed a tractor pulled out of mud at midnight. He had spent 20 years helping organize a shared equipment cooperative among small farmers too cash-tight to replace major machinery alone. The co-op line at Heartland Security Bank financed combines, planters, and repair inventory under terms negotiated after a disastrous flood season. Without that line, nearly 40 farms would be forced into emergency rentals or crop loss. Caleb looked at the summary sheet in Paul Renner's hand. 40 families are tied to that account, he said. Paul shrugged. Then maybe they should have chosen a stronger spokesman. Caleb put his cap back on, turned, and walked out without another word. The bank staff thought that meant the meeting was over. It was not. It was only the beginning of the part they would remember. The Heartland Farm Equipment Cooperative had started in a machine shed after the drought of 2009. Caleb and a handful of growers realized what every small operator eventually learns: one bad year can break a man, but one bad year shared among many can sometimes be survived. They pooled repair stock, shared labor, traded use windows on larger equipment. Eventually they formalized the group and negotiated a revolving line with the bank to maintain major assets before harvest. It was not charity and it was not sentiment. It was disciplined rural math. For years the system worked. Then a regional banking consolidation changed the people at the top. Heartland Security moved from local judgment to portfolio optics. The new executives liked agricultural lending in brochures and disliked it in complexity. When flood damage hit again that spring, the co-op negotiated temporary benchmarks tied to delayed crop recovery and insured receivables. The farmers met those benchmarks. Caleb had the signed minutes, payment logs, and email confirmations to prove it. Then, without warning, the bank froze the line, citing elevated risk and discretionary review. Suppliers began withholding parts. Repair orders stalled. One combine needed a transmission housing that no single-member farm could cover alone. Caleb asked for a meeting. That was when Paul Renner told him he was nobody. Paul thought he was dismissing one old farmer. He did not understand that Caleb Danner's whole life had been spent becoming exactly the kind of man other farmers listened to when something mattered. Caleb went home, sat at the kitchen table, and took out the yellow spiral notebook where he kept names and numbers in thick black ink. His wife June watched him for a moment and asked only one question. How bad was it? Caleb answered, bad enough. Then he started calling. Not with speeches. Not with outrage. Just facts. The line is frozen. The bank is backing off the benchmark agreement. Bring your paperwork. Meet at the co-op shed at 6. By sunset the gravel lot outside the shed was full of pickups. Men and women came carrying binders, envelopes, phone printouts, deferred payment notices, insurance letters, and signed restructuring emails. Some had driven 40 miles. Some came straight from irrigating soybeans. Some had never attended a formal protest in their lives and did not use that word now. They simply wanted the bank to honor what it had signed. At the folding table under the shop lights, Caleb laid out the documents. 40 farms had direct exposure. Many more had indirect ties through harvest timing, rental swaps, labor, and grain hauling. By 8:30, one thing was clear. This was no isolated misunderstanding. Multiple members had received conflicting instructions from bank officers. Two had written confirmation that the benchmark plan remained active the same week the freeze went into effect. One had an email from a credit manager warning that executive review might reset agricultural tolerance regardless of field-level accommodation. June stood by the coffee urn and listened until the room quieted. "What are you going to do?" someone asked Caleb. He looked around the shed, then said, "Tomorrow morning, we're going to help the bank count." The next morning Heartland Security Bank opened at 9. At 8:42, the first pickups began lining both sides of Maple Street. At 8:56, the parking lot filled. By 9 o'clock, 300 farmers, spouses, hired hands, co-op members, and neighboring landowners stood outside the bank office carrying folders, account packets, and signs nobody had professionally printed. Most were simple. Honor the benchmark. Read the agreement. We were here before your merger. The staff behind the lobby glass looked out as if weather had arrived in human form. Paul Renner, from his office upstairs, initially assumed it was a feed price demonstration or some local election stunt. Then his assistant came in pale and said, "They're here for you." Caleb did not try to push inside with a crowd. He did something worse for the bank. He organized. A sign-in sheet was placed at the front entrance. Copies of benchmark documents were sorted into boxes by county. Two retired bookkeepers from the church began matching names to account numbers. A local reporter arrived. Then a television van from the city. Then the county commissioner, who had no intention of being seen on the wrong side of 300 voters holding signed bank papers. At 9:20, the bank's council asked Caleb to send in 5 representatives. Caleb answered, "We sent one yesterday." At 9:30, Paul Renner looked out through the second-floor glass and saw what power looks like when it does not wear a suit. It looks like patience multiplied. What broke the bank first was not shouting. There was very little of that. What broke them was documentation at scale. Every time an executive tried to call the freeze temporary, another farmer held up an email. Every time the bank claimed the benchmark plan was discretionary, someone produced a signed meeting summary. Every time they said elevated risk justified caution, a supplier invoice or insurance commitment showed reliance on the agreement. By midday the sidewalk outside Heartland Security had become a paper wall. Stacks of copied letters sat on folding tables. A retired FSA officer walked the local press through the co-op structure. A crop insurer confirmed delayed receivables were part of the benchmark model the bank had already approved. Then one of the co-op members, a widow named Sharon Bell, brought forward the document that shifted everything. It was an internal memo she had received by mistake when the bank responded to her inquiry. Agricultural exceptions to be tightened post-merger. Cooperative exposures may be ideal candidates for strategic contraction despite local accommodations. Strategic contraction. That was the phrase the television reporter read on air at 12:46. By 1 o'clock the bank's corporate office was calling non-stop. By 1:30 Paul Renner finally came downstairs. He tried to speak over the crowd. Caleb raised one hand, and the whole sidewalk went quiet enough to hear paper move. Paul said, "We are prepared to review individual cases." Caleb answered, "That's not what you froze." Paul swallowed. "Then we are prepared to review the cooperative line." Caleb looked back at the rows of farmers, then at the cameras, then at the folder in Sharon Bell's hand. "Start by saying we weren't nobody." Paul did not say it. But he also did not go back upstairs. By late afternoon the bank had agreed to emergency mediation with Cooperative Council, state agricultural credit representatives, and 3 elected farm delegates chosen on the spot from the crowd. Caleb was one of them. Sharon Bell was another. The third was Luis Ortega, a young corn grower whose financial records were so meticulous even the bank's lawyers stopped arguing with his spreadsheet printouts after 10 minutes. Inside the conference room, the tone had changed completely. No one mentioned nobody. No one pretended the freeze was minor. Heartland Security now faced reputational damage, regulatory scrutiny, possible promissory estoppel claims, and a public demonstration large enough to make investors nervous. The co-op's lawyer laid out the core problem simply. The bank had induced reliance on benchmark terms, confirmed them in writing, then froze the facility under a post-merger strategy that directly contradicted local agreements. Paul Renner looked smaller by then, though he wore the same suit. By 7 that evening the bank signed a temporary reinstatement of the cooperative line, immediate release of repair and parts disbursements, fee waivers related to the freeze period, and a binding review of all post-merger agricultural exception policies affecting the co-op. That would have been enough for many people. It was not enough for Caleb. He asked for one more thing. A written statement confirming the farmers had complied with the benchmark plan before the freeze. The bank resisted. Caleb said, "Then we stay tomorrow." The statement was signed 13 minutes later. The crowd began to thin only after copies were handed out and everyone who needed parts authorizations had them in writing. Sunset hit the glass front of the bank, turning it gold for a few minutes in a way the building had not earned. Before leaving, Caleb stood on the sidewalk with June while pickups pulled away in long slow lines. 300, she said softly. Caleb nodded. They came fast. June looked at him. No. They came ready. That's different. A week later Heartland Security issued a carefully worded statement about constructive dialogue and valued agricultural relationships. Paul Renner was reassigned out of the region before the end of the month. The co-op line remained active through harvest, and later negotiations converted it into a more protective structure that the bank could not freeze on executive mood alone. People told the story afterward with the quote first, and that made sense. The banker said, "You're nobody." Then 300 farmers showed up at his office. But the deeper truth was simpler. Paul Renner had mistaken one quiet man for one isolated man. He had looked at Caleb Danner and seen mud, age, and a cap in hand. He had not seen the years of midnight repairs, shared diesel, funeral casseroles, borrowed hay wagons, and favors returned without invoices. He had not seen the invisible ledger country people keep with one another until the day it becomes visible all at once. That was what showed up at his office. Not outrage alone. Not spectacle. A community with receipts. And after that, nobody in Heartland Security used the word nobody so carelessly again.